In early March of 1579, a Spanish army advanced on the Dutch city of Maastricht. This marked the beginning of a 111-day siege, characterized by bloody assaults, intense mine warfare, and massive construction efforts, including a 20-meter-high artillery platform. The defenders were so determined to hold the city that even after the enemy breached the walls, they fought on and built an entire second earthen rampart inside. Maastricht was one of the most important fortresses in the region due to its position on the border river Maas. It had long served as a Spanish stronghold after they gained control of the Netherlands in 1556, but in 1577 it fell to the Dutch, who used it in their uprising against the Spanish crown. King Philip II of Spain was determined to reassert his authority and reconquer Maastricht. To achieve this, he dispatched one of the most capable generals of the time, Alessandro Farnese, the future Duke of Parma. Maastricht now faced the most formidable opponent the Dutch revolt had ever encountered. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Maastricht. Here's something unexpected. Heroes of History, today's sponsor, is a mobile strategy game where Cleopatra, Hercules and Robin Hood can team up to stop Tesla from sabotaging the moon landing. It blends historical storytelling with strategic gameplay, and it's more thoughtful than it has any right to be. Players build their own civilization, unlock technologies through the ages, and summon legendary figures like Julius Caesar, Joan of Arc or Queen Elizabeth I, each featuring detailed biographies rooted in real-world history and myth. The game is designed for relaxed play, no raids while offline, and progress continues without punishing mechanics. Currently, a limited-time moon landing event is live. The storyline features Einstein uncovering a plot by Tesla to alter the course of history, leading to a time travel mission to protect one of humanity's greatest achievements. Participation involves constructing a cultural event city, battling in PvP, and competing in weekly leaderboards. Rewards include powerful relics like the 5-star sky disk of Nebra, 4-star lunar meteorite, and more, along with boosted chances of summoning top-tier heroes during the event. Once the event ends, acquiring these heroes becomes significantly harder. For anyone interested in a surprisingly deep, historically inspired strategy game, Heroes of History is available to download via my link in the description or the QR code on screen. Perfect for history fans who enjoy seeing the past reimagined, with a twist. In 1575, a Spanish force launched a new campaign against the Dutch rebels. The offensive began with a promising success. Some troops advanced as far as the outskirts of Rotterdam, while others attacked the islands of Zeeland and laid siege to Sierkizee. However, as the army had penetrated deeper into rebel territory than ever before, devastating news arrived. On the 1st of September 1575, King Philip II declared national bankruptcy. Unrest erupted among the soldiers, many of whom had gone unpaid for more than 2 years. Don Louis de Requesens y Zuniga, the Spanish governor of the Netherlands, struggled to maintain order. When he died unexpectedly on the 5th of March 1576, the fragile control he had maintained collapsed entirely. Sierkizee surrendered on the 13th of July, prompting the soldiers to demand their long overdue payment. As expected, the interim government in Brussels was unable to meet their demands. In response, the troops mutinied, marched through the Netherlands in a wave of violence and looting. These brutal riots, which soon spread to garrisons in larger cities, became known as the Spanish Fury. The most infamous of these events was the sack of Antwerp, an orgy of violence that reportedly claimed 8,000 lives over just 3 days. As the Spanish central government was doing little to stop the atrocities, the Dutch provinces took matters into their own hands. On the 8th of November 1576, they signed the Pacification of Ghent, a treaty demanding the withdrawal of all foreign troops from the Netherlands, the restoration of traditional rights and privileges, and a return of power to the States General, the representative assembly of the provinces. For the first time, all provinces, except Luxembourg, stood united in opposition to Spanish rule. Requesens' successor was none other than John of Austria, the famed victor of Lepanto. In February of 1577, the new governor confirmed the pacification of Ghent through the so-called Perpetual Edict, which ordered Spanish troops to evacuate the remaining fortresses and return to Italy. Cities like Antwerp or Maastricht thus came under Dutch control. In exchange, John of Austria demanded recognition as ruler and continued adherence to Catholicism. However, widespread resistance to the latter condition soon escalated tensions. On the 24th of July 1577, Don John launched a renewed offensive, capturing the citadel of Namur. The Dutch considered this a breach of the Perpetual Edict, and under the leadership of William of Orange, began preparing for another armed confrontation. John of Austria also began raising new troops. Spain's military capacity had been restored, thanks to the arrival of silver from the New World and a lull in hostilities with the Ottoman Empire, which had previously occupied much of Philip II's attention. With resources replenished, the king sent additional reinforcements to the Netherlands. In the winter of 1577 and 1578, Alessandro Farnese, the future Duke of Parma, marched to Italy at the head of a fresh army. When Parma arrived in the Netherlands in January of 1578, John of Austria immediately launched an offensive. At the Battle of Gembloux, his forces routed the entire army of the States General. He then advanced to Leuven, besieged Sichem and Neveles, and captured several towns near Brussels. Although the rebels managed to halt the Spanish advance at Rijmenam in July, Don John soon secured control of the upper Meuse Valley and established a fortified stronghold consisting of 4 key fortresses: Marienburg, Philippeville, Givet, and Namur. When John of Austria died later in that year, Parma followed in his footsteps. According to Christopher Duffy, an expert on early modern siege warfare, this, quote, presented the rebels with the most formidable opponent they had yet encountered. Around the same time, the fragile unity by the pacification of Ghent began to unravel. Increasing religious tensions and conflicting political interests led to the emergence of 2 opposing factions. One faction consisted of the provinces governed by William of Orange, Holland and Zeeland, which became the stronghold of the rebellion. On January 23, 1579, they joined several other provinces and cities to form the Union of Utrecht, creating a defensive alliance based on the pacification of Ghent. The opposing faction was made up of conservative Catholic provinces, advocating reconciliation with Spain. These provinces formed the Union of Arras on the 6th of January 1579. The States General desperately tried to preserve the endangered unity, but Parma was already preparing a new offensive, effectively ending any hopes for reconciliation. He set himself an ambitious objective for his first year of campaigning: to advance northward along the Meuse River and recapture the strategically vital city of Maastricht. Maastricht had been anticipating an attack since the beginning of the year. The city's central location, economic importance, and formidable defenses made it a key strategic fortress on the Spanish border, one that Philip II was determined to reclaim. To strengthen the defenders, William of Orange sent Sebastian Tepin to Maastricht. This engineer from Lorraine was tasked with backing up the city's military governor, Melchior von Schwarzenberg. Tepin proved a worthy adversary for Parma. He had made a name for himself in 1573, defending the French fortress of La Rochelle during the French Wars of Religion, and was widely regarded as both competent and courageous. Arriving in Maastricht in January, Tepin immediately inspected the fortifications and set to work improving them. He cleared the ditches of debris, repaired the walls, and reinforced the city's weakest gates with ravelins, triangular outworks designed to strengthen vulnerable points. He also conducted galleries and tunnels within the counterscarp, the outer wall of the moat, to enable rapid responses to enemy mining operations, and built counter-approaches, trenches allowing his troops safe movement outside the moat. Thanks to the dedicated help of the population, Tepin managed to complete the work before Parma appeared before the city at the beginning of March. The first sign of Parma's arrival was a cavalry vanguard that swept through the surrounding countryside, driving the rural population into Maastricht. A few days later, on the 8th of March, Parma himself arrived with the main force of approximately 18,000 men and established his headquarters at the Petersheim castle. Once settled, he offered the townspeople a general amnesty, promising that if they surrendered immediately, all of their rights and privileges would be preserved. The defenders refused, and the Spanish troops began to surround Maastricht. Parma threw a ring of 6 forts around the city like a fisherman's net, and connected the 2 banks of the Maas with 2 pontoon bridges. Since the pioneers ordered by Ernst von Mansfeld, the governor of Luxembourg, had not arrived, the soldiers were forced to take on the earthworks themselves, much to their annoyance, as they detested the hard, strenuous labor. To motivate them, Parma personally took up a shovel. Unlike many generals of his time, he was not afraid to get his hands dirty, climb into trenches himself, or even wade waist deep through swampy moats. Meanwhile, the defenders were already grappling with the first consequences of Parma's carefully planned approach. He had timed the cavalry raid to coincide with a market day, trapping hundreds of merchants, farmers and day laborers inside the city, along with the townspeople. There were no provisions for these additional mouths to feed, forcing von Schwarzenberg to impose food rationing from the outset. Once the Spanish had completed their ring of fortresses, their batteries opened fire on Maastricht with a thunderous volley. Soon after, the first trenches began snaking their way toward the city. The noose was tightening. Von Schwarzenberg and Tappin mounted a highly active defense of the city. Time and again, they sent detachments from the 1,200-strong garrison and the citizen militia into the enemy trenches to harass the Spanish workers. These sorties inflicted significant damage on the attackers, but ultimately failed to prevent them from reaching the moat, which they did on the 20th of March. The Spaniards immediately constructed additional batteries and began bombarding the ravelin in front of the Tongeren port. When the guns opened a breach 3 days later, Parma ordered an assault. The Spanish vanguard advanced through the gap and began seizing the outer works piece by piece in a battle that raged for several hours. They had already occupied much of the position when it became clear that Parma had underestimated Tappin. The engineer had foreseen the attack and positioned additional artillery along the walls behind the ravelin. These new guns caught the Spaniards in a deadly crossfire, forcing them to quickly retreat. Parma's first assault had failed, and he was fuming with rage. The Spaniards regrouped, brought more artillery into position, and began digging additional trenches in front of the Brussels port and the Bosch port. The aim was to stretch the defenders thin by forcing them to divide their forces. However, progress was slow, and heavy rainfall turned the trenches into a swampy quagmire. A few days later, 2 explosions shook the city. The Spanish had detonated 2 mines beneath the ravelin in front of the Tongeren port. Although the damage was relatively minor, Tappin suspected it was only the beginning. Indeed, over the following weeks, the focus of the siege shifted underground. The Spanish repeatedly attempted to tunnel beneath the defenses, but the defenders were now alert. Listening posts and miners monitored the ground from the galleries in the outer moat walls. Whenever they detected suspicious activity, they dug countermines, blocked enemy tunnels, or tried to neutralize the charges. A special role in this subterranean struggle was filled by the 3 companies of women who called themselves mine mistresses. They kept large cauldrons of boiling water ready to pour into enemy tunnels to scald the Spanish miners, and burned greenwood to create smoke to suffocate them. To force the smoke into the tunnels, they allegedly repurposed the bellows of the organ in St. Serviatus Basilica. Thanks in large part to the mine mistresses, the defenders maintained the upper hand underground for quite some time. It was only on the 31st of March, when Parma sent in several dozens of volunteers armed with thick shields and long pistols to clear the tunnels, that the Spanish managed to gain control of their underground network. Almost simultaneously, the defenders launched an assault above ground. Tapin personally led a sortie into the Spanish trenches at the Brussels port. The Spaniards were taking their midday rest when suddenly 600 infantry and 60 cavalry fell upon them. Caught off guard, many of the men didn't have time to light the fuses of their muskets before Tapin's troops killed 50 and destroyed nearly 150 paces of trench. Additionally, sorties in the following days achieved similar successes. Among those captured were 5 Spanish pioneers. Tapin interrogated them, but they refused to reveal Parma's intentions. Only when the defenders tied up their leader and threw him in the Maas with a weight tied to his feet did the others start talking. They told Tapin that Parma was preparing to storm the city as soon as possible. Despite their initial successes, the defenders' situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Food was running low, the men were exhausted, and the Spanish were tightening their noose around the city. Von Schwarzenberg and Tapin hung their hopes on relief from the outside. On a rainy night in early April, they dispatched a party of 8 men downriver in a small boat to alert the States General to the worsening crisis. As the darkness swallowed them, Tapin could only pray that they would slip through the Spanish lines unseen. On the 3rd of April, the Spaniards detonated a mine beneath the tower near the Tonghorn port. As the dust settled and a breach became visible, they surged up the debris field to storm the walls. But once they reached the top, they came under heavy crossfire from the neighboring towers. The assault faltered, and moments later, Tapin led a counterattack into the breach, forcing the attackers to retreat. Parma sent a second wave of fresh troops, but they too were driven back by the defenders' cannon fire. The failed assault made one thing clear: Maastricht was not yet ready to surrender. Determined to break their will, Parma ordered a sustained bombardment of the city. Spanish bombs rained down for days, and nowhere within the walls was safe. The defenders were forced to work through the night to repair the damage, their strength waning. On the 8th of April, the Spaniards detonated a mine beneath the ravelin in front of the Tonghorn port, blasting apart a corner of the outwork. A forlorn hope of 80 men immediately stormed the breach. This time, they managed to gain a foothold on the fortification and push forward. Inch by inch, they fought their way toward the town, until they encountered a second earth wall that Tapin had secretly constructed behind the first line. However, when reinforcements arrived, they were able to capture this new entrenchment too. The defenders launched a counterattack, but it came too late. The attackers had already entrenched themselves. The ravelin was lost. On the same day, the Spaniards intercepted a carrier pigeon with a message to the defenders. It was the States General's reply to Maastricht's desperate call for help. The messengers had succeeded. They had slipped unnoticed beneath one of the Spanish bridges and delivered the plea for aid. When the message was presented to Parma, he learned that reinforcements would arrive before the 15th of April. With time running short, he convened a council of war and ordered his artillery and sappers to prepare. He wanted to launch a decisive assault on Maastricht the next morning. Maastricht was rudely awakened in the early hours of the 9th of April. 6 large cannons thundered as they bombarded the Boschport from the German bank of the Maas, while Spanish workers feverishly pumped out the moat before the gate. When Tapin rushed to the ramparts, he spotted several large assault columns massed before the gates. Immediately, he sounded the alarm, and soon all able-bodied inhabitants of Maastricht were on the walls. At dawn, the Spaniards detonated 2 more mines, and then began their assault. The attack on the Boschport was led by Fabio Farnese, Parma's nephew. His storming party managed to cross the trench, storm the breach, and drive back the Dutch on their first attempt. But the defenders' counterattack, personally led by Tapin, was so fierce that it crushed Farnese and most of his men on the spot. The Dutch quickly regained their position, where they steadfastly repelled wave after wave of attackers. Only when the Spaniards, driven to desperation, began erecting makeshift breastworks from the bodies of their fallen comrades did they manage to claw their way up to the wall, only to find that Tapin had prepared a second line of defense there as well. The attacks on the Brussels port and the Tongeren port also failed, largely due to the defenders' massive artillery fire. By evening, when Parma realized the situation was hopeless, he ordered a retreat. According to Christopher Duffy, this assault alone cost around 2,000 lives. Overall, Parma had lost nearly a third of his army to constant fighting, disease, and desertion. Facing heavy losses and dwindling powder supplies, which would take time to replenish from Luxembourg, he knew he could make no further progress through direct assault. Instead, Parma decided to undertake major construction work. His depleted army was vulnerable to counterattacks, so, as a precaution, he expanded his ring of forts into a full circumvallation of 16 forts. This move made perfect sense, as the States General and William of Orange had long been gathering funds to raise an army for Maastricht's relief. Their preparations dragged on, but sooner or later, a Dutch force would come marching to challenge his siege. Parma was not the only one reaching for a shovel. Tapin and the defenders worked tirelessly to restore the city's fortifications and launched an ambitious new project of their own. They constructed an additional ravelin in front of the Brussels port, outfitted with caponiers, solidly walled artillery positions. Behind the Brussels port, they erected a massive earthen rampart, with a breastwork of bulwarks and a moat. This third line of defense was intended as a fallback should the ravelin and gate fall. Progress was slow, however. The people of Maastricht were exhausted and starving. They had begun to slaughter their remaining livestock, and the city council forced those with more than they needed to sell their supplies at fixed prices. Life in the city was lived on a shoestring, with many barely able to stay upright. Tapin had good reason to burden the exhausted townspeople with such heavy labor. Parma's second construction project posed an imminent threat. The Spanish general had begun building a colossal artillery platform directly in front of the Brussels port. Towering over 20 meters high, it gave his gunners a commanding view of Maastricht, and, more crucially, the ability to fire down on the city's defenses. Parma mounted 3 heavy guns atop the platform, intending first to demolish the ravelin, then the gate, and finally the third defensive line behind it. The plan worked with brutal efficiency. Within 2 weeks, the ravelin lay in ruins, and the Spaniards seized what was left of it. Capturing this single outwork had cost Parma another 2,000 men and 5 weeks of fighting, but at last the path to the city walls was clear. The Spaniards set up a new battery on the shattered remains of the ravelin, which, together with the towering artillery platform, began pounding the towers flanking the Brussels port. At the same time, they constructed a covered gallery across the moat and began digging multiple tunnels beneath it. Once these reached the base of the city wall, they detonated 3 mines, blasting open a wide breach. Spanish troops quickly seized the gap and entrenched themselves on the wall section between the St. Servatius Tower and the Brussels port. The sudden ease of Parma's advance spoke volumes. Maastricht's defenders were spent. Hunger and disease had reduced Tapin's force to just 400 able-bodied soldiers. No relief army was in sight, and the enemy now stood at the city walls. Most cities would have surrendered, but not Maastricht. Tapin and his remaining men took up position on the final earth rampart, joined by the last able-bodied civilians and 8 cannons. They were determined to fight for every meter. The defenders' resolve meant little to Parma. He had a bridge thrown over the moat, raised a 3rd battery on the rampart, and began bombarding Maastricht from its own walls. Soon, the 3rd line of defense lay shattered. The Spaniards attacked again, Tapin led the resistance from the front, standing shoulder to shoulder with his men, until a musket ball struck him down. Gravely wounded, he was carried from the field. With their commander gone, the defenders wavered. The line began to crumble. For a moment, it seemed Maastricht was lost. But then, through the haze of gunsmoke, a litter emerged. It took the wary defenders a moment to realize what they were seeing. Tapin, despite life-threatening injury, barely bandaged, had returned to the front. His defiance, even on the brink of death, reignited the city's spirit. The citizens rallied, mustering their last strength to throw the Spaniards back once more. Then, a second surge of hope. Reinforcements from the States General had arrived, at last. Johann von Nassau-Dillenburg arrived near Maastricht with 3,000 to 4,000 cavalry and 100 companies of infantry. After carefully surveying the area, he came to a grim conclusion. Parma's ring of fortifications was impenetrable. Realizing a direct assault would be futile, Johann sent a messenger to propose a truce. But Parma, so close to victory, was unwilling to compromise. On the 23rd of June, he curtly replied that he would accept nothing less than Maastricht's unconditional surrender. Meanwhile, Parma himself had fallen ill, racked by fever, and confined to his bed. He nevertheless continued directing the siege. On the 26th of June, he sent the defenders a final ultimatum. If they surrendered immediately, he would spare the city. But surrender was out of the question. The defenders rejected his offer outright, and Tapin even began planning for a last-ditch fallback. He wanted to retreat with his remaining troops behind the medieval wall of the Old Town, and from there to the Wick district on the German side of the river, where the shorter, more manageable defenses offered a final hope. But that plan would never be realized. After the ultimatum was refused, the Spaniards began preparing for a last, crushing assault. The final assault began in the early hours of the 29th of June. All available Spanish troops surged through the Brussels port, crashing into the weakened second line of defense. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but they no longer had the numbers or strength to hold the line. One by one, their positions fell, and the survivors began a chaotic retreat toward Wick. The Spaniards gave no quarter. What began as an orderly fallback quickly devolved into a frenzied chase, and then into a massacre. Tapin and the remaining soldiers fled across the bridge to Wick, setting in the blaze behind them. As the flames consumed the structure, it collapsed, sending hundreds of fleeing townspeople into the Maas River. Many perished in the fire or drowned. According to custom, the victors plundered the conquered city for 3 days. They poured over the defeated city in a wave of brutal vengeance. With Parma still bedridden, there was no one to restrain the troops. The sack of Maastricht descended into a horrific massacre. No one was spared, and the city paid dearly for its resistance. What became of Tapin and his men amid the chaos remains uncertain. Some sources claim the engineer was captured and died weeks later at Petersheim Castle. Others say Spanish soldiers found him defenseless in a bed and executed him without trial. In the aftermath, Parma solidified his grip on the southern Netherlands. Over the next 3 years, most cities surrendered with little resistance. Meanwhile, internal tensions among the Dutch provinces deepened. In 1580, these strains erupted into open conflict, when the northeastern provinces rose up in counter-revolution. Just over a year later, on the 24th of July 1581, the members of the Union of Utrecht formally declared independence from Spain. This marked the beginning of the birth of the Dutch Republic, and irrevocably split the Low Countries in two. What had begun as a rebellion against royal authority had become a full-fledged struggle for independence. If you found this video entertaining or educational, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Creating this content takes a lot of time and effort. And let's be honest, the 80 Years' War isn't exactly trending, which makes it even harder to get noticed by the YouTube algorithm. Even a small tip can make a big difference in keeping the channel going. As a thank you, our Patreon supporters get regular updates and exclusive artwork previews. Your support means a lot. Thank you.